Right now, there is a farmer in Kenya staring at his fields, realizing he just cannot afford the fertilizer he needs to grow this season's crops.
Yeah, and the wild thing is, the reason he can't afford it is happening, what, 4,000 miles away?
Exactly. Because a single 21-mile wide stretch of water in the Middle East has been closed off. It's April 21st, 2026. And, if you've looked at the price of gas or groceries or just turned on the news lately, the global economy is kind of just holding its breath.
Oh, absolutely holding its breath.
So the mission of this deep dive is to unpack exactly how a localized military conflict triggers this massive global cascade. And we're using a really dense, just fascinating academic report titled Supply Chain.pdf to do it. It basically uses game theory to explain the economic shockwaves of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
It is a phenomenal blueprint for understanding the hidden wiring of the modern world, really. But before we get into the mechanisms of that shockwave, we probably need to establish the baseline facts of where things stand today.
Right. And I want to pause here and be incredibly clear with you listening right now. Our goal here is not to endorse any political or military viewpoint.
Right, we're not taking sides left or right.
Exactly. Our job is strictly to impartially analyze the geoeconomic and supply chain realities laid out in our source material. So, here's the timeline. On February 28th, 2026, the U.S. and Israel initiated Operation Epic Fury against Iran.
Which was a massive military campaign.
Right, and it resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. So in retaliation, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. As of right now, President Trump has announced an indefinite Pakistan-mediated ceasefire. But
the underlying confrontation is entirely unresolved.
exactly, U.S. Navy interdictions are continuing. Just days ago, the USS Spruance seized the Iranian flag vessel Tuska in the Gulf of Oman.
Which leaves the global system in this weird state of suspended animation. Like, the kinetic warfare might be on pause, but the economic warfare, the structural disruption to global trade is just accelerating.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's move from the military conflict to the physical, geographic reality of this choke point. Because the military strike triggered a maritime closure.
Right.
But this analysis makes it terrifyingly clear that yanking this one geographic thread unravels commodities way beyond just oil.
I mean, we do have to start with the oil shock, though, because the sheer scale is staggering.
Oh, for sure.
The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a shipping lane. It's literally the world's most critical energy artery. Under normal conditions, about 20 million barrels of oil pass through there every single day.
Which is, what, 20% of global seaborne oil trade?
Roughly, yeah. So when the closure hit, traffic plummeted by 70% almost instantly and then effectively flatlined to zero.
And reading through the data, the human and logistical bottleneck was just immediate. Like 20,000 mariners were suddenly stranded.
Yeah.
Even 15,000 cruise ship passengers just found themselves trapped in the Persian Gulf.
And the markets reacted violently. The International Energy Agency characterized this as a more severe physical supply shock than the energy crises of the 1970s.
Wait, really? Worse than the 70s?
Yeah, Brent crude spiked to $126 a barrel in March. But there's a secondary metric here that is far more revealing, I think. The physical delivery price, what the industry calls dated Brent, hit $132 a barrel for Asian importers.
Wait, let's clarify that for a second. What exactly is dated Brent, and why does the $6 difference between that and regular Brent crude matter so much?
Well, think of regular Brent crude as a paper contract. It's basically traders betting on the price of oil weeks or months from now.
Okay.
But dated Brent is the price for actual physical wet barrels of oil that are loaded onto a ship with a specific date attached to them.
Oh, I see.
So when dated Brent surges past the paper price, it means buyers aren't just speculating on future panic. They are desperate for physical oil right this second, just to keep their power grids running. It proves genuine physical scarcity.
Which translates directly to the pain we're seeing at home, with U.S. gas sitting at $4.11 a gallon on average. But here's the thing that really blew my mind.
Yeah.
If you pull back from just the energy sector, the global economy looks less like a machine and more like a massive web. It's like the global economy is a giant Jenga tower. Everyone thought yanking out the Hormuz block would just make the oil piece wobble, but suddenly the food, packaging, and technology pieces are crashing down too.
That's a great analogy, because the strait is the transit corridor for a massive percentage of the world's industrial baseline.
Right.
Take the strike on Qatar's Ras Laffan Industrial City Complex. That isolated event took out an estimated 17% of Qatar's liquefied natural gas production capacity.
17%.
Yeah, and given the highly specialized bespoke engineering of those facilities, repairs are estimated to take 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years. Wow. But here's where I need you to connect the dots for me. How does a damaged natural gas facility in Qatar circle back to that farmer in Kenya we talked about at the start of the deep dive?
It all comes down to chemistry. Natural gas isn't just for heating homes. It's the primary feedstock for creating ammonia, which is then synthesized into urea.
And urea is fertilizer.
Exactly. It's the foundation of the world's nitrogen-based fertilizers. The Gulf region accounts for nearly half of global urea production and 30% of its ammonia.
Oh, wow.
So when you take Qatar's LNG offline and trap the remaining fertilizer exports behind the Hormuz blockade, you essentially sever the food chain.
Yeah.
The IMF warned that urea prices in Africa doubled from $400 to $800 a ton, like almost overnight.
Meaning crop yields will plummet and global food prices are just going to skyrocket. But the chain reaction keeps going. The research outlines a sudden scarcity of sulfur. Why sulfur?
Yeah.
And how did that end up disrupting copper production all the way over in Chile?
Right, so sulfur is a byproduct of oil and gas refining in the Middle East. If no oil is moving, no sulfur is moving.
Makes sense.
And you need thousands of tons of sulfur to create sulfuric acid. In places like Chile, which is the world's largest copper producer, they pour vast pools of sulfuric acid over crushed rock to literally leach the copper out of the ore.
So without Middle Eastern sulfur?
South American copper mining grinds to a halt.
Exactly. That is wild. And it's the same story with aluminum. Prices are surging, and the Gulf accounts for 20% of global raw aluminum exports. I always used to think aluminum was just about mining bauxite, but it's actually entirely dependent on energy, isn't it?
Oh, aluminum smelting is incredibly energy intensive. People in the industry often joke that aluminum is basically just congealed electricity.
Congealed electricity. I like that.
Yeah, so without the cheap, abundant natural gas flowing out of the Gulf to power those massive smelters, the production math falls apart entirely.
Yeah.
And we haven't even touched on helium.
Right. A third of the world's helium was impaired, which, people think of for party balloons, but it's actually critical for MRI machines and manufacturing fiber optic cables. It has to be transported at ultra-low temperatures, so distributors were already rationing deliveries by early April.
It's a huge bottleneck.
But I have to ask the obvious question here. If shutting down this 21-mile stretch of water takes out our medical helium, our copper supply, and the fertilizer to grow the world's food, how did we let the global system get this fragile?
Well, it was a deliberate choice. For 30 years, the global economy was ruthlessly optimized for just-in-time delivery.
Right.
Corporations concentrated production wherever it was cheapest, held zero inventory to save money, and just assumed the oceans would always be safe and open.
Right, because building redundancies like paying to store massive domestic stockpiles of sulfur or fertilizer is expensive.
Exactly. And the markets actively punished companies that spent money on resilience. They basically priced the geopolitical risk at zero.
Until the risk became reality. Which brings us to how the rest of the world is reacting, because now that we see the vulnerabilities exposed, different global players aren't panicking. They're calculating.
Right. Our source material models this strategic landscape using an academic framework called Bayesian game theory.
Okay, you're going to have to Eli 5 that for me. Explain it like I'm 5.
Sure. Think of global geopolitics right now like high-stakes game of Texas. Hold'em. In Bayesian game theory, players have to make decisions without knowing the cards in their opponent's hand.
Okay.
So they start with a baseline assumption, their Bayesian prior. But every time an opponent flinches or raises a bet or reacts to a piece of news, the players constantly update the math in their heads about what cards that opponent holds.
So applied to the real world, no one knows exactly what another country's breaking point is. They're just looking for tells at the poker table.
Precisely.
Like, for example, everyone is watching how the U.S. reacts to gas hitting $4.11 a gallon during an election year.
That is precisely the right way to look at it. Does domestic political pressure over gas prices force Washington to blink and recalibrate its sanctions? These countries are updating their assumptions in real time, figuring out exactly how much leverage they can extract from the chaos.
So let's look at the players at the table, starting with Russia. The analysis essentially calls this a massive fiscal windfall for them, like they're sitting on a giant stack of chips.
They capture the immediate upside of elevated global energy prices, because they're a major hydrocarbon exporter whose supply routes don't rely on Hormuz at all.
Right.
The projections indicate Russia could gain up to $161 billion in incremental export revenues in a 3-month scenario.
Wow.
And they're aggressively expanding their shadow fleet of tankers to sell to alternative buyers, entirely bypassing Western markets. This revenue surge directly subsidizes their military expenditures in Ukraine. They're actively weaponizing the global energy scarcity.
Which brings us to China. Now, I do have to push back on the text here a bit. The analysis labels China a constrained beneficiary. But looking at the timeline, they stockpiled 16% more crude in January and February before the conflict even started.
Yeah, I do.
It sounds to me like they read the poker table perfectly and are just winning. How are they constrained?
Well, a stockpile is just a temporary buffer, right? It's not a cure for a structural dependency. China still imports roughly 5.4 million barrels of oil a day through the Strait of Hormuz.
Oh, I see.
That is more than double what they import overland from Russia. When global energy prices skyrocket, it acts as an anchor dragging down their entire manufacturing-based GDP. They knew a disruption was possible, hence the stockpiling, but they are highly vulnerable to a prolonged closure.
But they aren't just taking the hit passively, right? They're throwing their own asymmetrical chips onto the table.
Right, by restricting exports of rare earth elements. We're seeing them choke off supplies of gallium, germanium, and now sulfur. China controls immense portions of the refining capacity for these critical minerals.
Wow.
By restricting them, they impose crippling delays and costs on Western defense and technology supply chains. It's a textbook Bayesian move to signal, we can endure this pain, but we can also make sure you feel it too.
And then there's Turkey. The analysis calls them the gatekeeper. Because with the sea lanes blocked, the overland rail and road routes become incredibly valuable. Turkey controls the physical bridge between Asia and Europe.
And they're utilizing what is known as normative leverage. This means using the established rules and norms of international groups to their advantage.
How so?
Well, Turkey maintains its status as a vital NATO ally, which gives them diplomatic cover while simultaneously expanding trade ties with Russia and Central Asia. They're acting as the indispensable toll booth and back-channel mediator for all sides, extracting lucrative infrastructure concessions along the way.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We have Russia cashing in, China playing hardball with rare earths, and Turkey running the toll booth. If everyone is hedging their bets and weaponizing the disruption, who's actually losing this game? Like, who is stuck in the middle?
India serves as the prime example of the cost of strategic ambiguity.
Right, because India's whole strategy has been to be friends with everyone. I mean, they're part of the Quad Security Alliance with the U.S., but they buy massive amounts of discounted oil from Russia, and they've invested heavily in Iranian ports.
And on paper, that ambiguity initially paid off. India actually negotiated a formal exemption from Iran's Hormuz blockade.
But the data shows they still have $11.8 billion in exports at acute risk. If they have a diplomatic exemption, why are they taking such a massive financial hit?
Because a piece of paper from a diplomat doesn't fix a physically broken logistics system.
Good point.
Even with an exemption, an Indian vessel still has to pay sky-high war risk insurance premiums just to enter the Gulf. They still face the physical danger of being caught in a crossfire. Furthermore, India's agricultural sector is entering the Kharif season.
Oh, unpack the Kharif season for us.
It's the critical autumn monsoon planting season. If seeds and fertilizer don't go into the ground right now, the harvest fails.
And they don't have the fertilizer.
Exactly. Because of the Hormuz disruption, the Indian government is facing a brutal domestic choice. Do they allocate their limited natural gas supplies to generate electricity to keep the lights on? Or do they divert it to manufacture urea for the Kharif season? The analysis bluntly summarizes India's position. They have friends everywhere, but leverage nowhere.
Friends everywhere, leverage nowhere. That is a brutal reality check. And it leads perfectly into the physical reality of the global shipping map. Because these nations are successfully using this crisis for leverage, the old rules of global trade are permanently broken.
Yeah, Mayor.
We're moving into an entirely new era of logistics, and the maritime map has literally been redrawn.
The impairment of Hormuz compounds the ongoing avoidance of the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So now, the default artery for Asia to Europe trade isn't through the Middle East at all. Ships are routing all the way down around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern ping of Africa.
And the sheer scale of this detour is staggering. We are talking about massive container ships carrying thousands of metal boxes. Rerouting them adds 10 to 14 days to every single voyage.
Easily.
And the fuel costs alone are an extra $200,000 to $350,000 per trip. Plus, the European Union is now slapping massive carbon emissions taxes on these longer, dirtier voyages.
And beyond the cost, there's a cascading mechanical failure at the ports called vessel bunching.
Vessel bunching.
Yeah, think of it like a city bus route. If one bus gets delayed in traffic, the buses behind it catch up, and suddenly 3 buses arrive at a single bus stop at the exact same time.
Ah.
The stop just can't handle all those passengers at once.
Who applied to global shipping?
Because these longer trips are more unpredictable, multiple massive container ships are arriving at ports like Rotterdam or Hamburg simultaneously.
Oh, man.
A berth wait time that used to be 4 to 8 hours suddenly balloons to 72 hours. The cranes can't unload fast enough, the warehouses overflow, and the entire port infrastructure just gets paralyzed.
It's a traffic jam that backs up across oceans. And this new map isn't just about avoiding missiles, right? It's fostering entirely new, permanent alliances. The Atlantic Council coined a term for this, the axis of evasion. What exactly is that?
It describes the increasing coordination between China, Russia, and Iran to construct a parallel global economy that completely bypasses Western sanctions.
How do you do that?
They're integrating their supply chains. They use dark fleets of tankers that turn off their location transponders to move oil secretly. They're setting up alternative clearinghouses to trade in Chinese yuan instead of the US dollar, entirely avoiding the SWIFT banking system.
So the U.S. tries to punish them with sanctions, and their response is to just build their own walled garden where U.S. rules don't apply.
Exactly. And it exposes a critical vulnerability in the Western sanctions model. Sanctions only work if the domestic voters in the U.S. and Europe are willing to endure the economic blowback. If Western voters cannot tolerate $4.50 a gallon for gas or skyrocketing food prices, political pressure mounts, and the sanctions lose their credibility. The axis of evasion explicitly exploits that political sensitivity.
So put yourself in the shoes of the G7, the major Western economies. What is the playbook here? How do you adapt to a system that is fundamentally fragmenting?
Well, the recommendations in the report are pretty drastic. First, the concept of strategic reserves has to be completely overhauled.
Okay.
Currently, when there's an oil shock, the G7 releases a few million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But the recent release covered about 4 days of global consumption. In a prolonged multi-year crisis, that is a drop in the bucket.
So they need a much longer runway. The text suggests a 6-month buffer, I think.
A mandatory 6-month buffer. And crucially, it cannot just be for oil anymore. Governments need strategic reserves for critical minerals, for sulfur, for raw fertilizer inputs.
Wow.
The second major recommendation is harmonized friendshoring.
Friendshoring, meaning like moving factories out of rival nations and into allied countries. But what does making it harmonized mean?
It means closing the loopholes. The system needs standardized rules of origin. Right now, a company might claim they moved production to Mexico to be closer to the U.S. But if you look at the supply chain, they're just importing all the raw parts from China and snapping them together in Mexico to bypass tariffs.
Ah, I see.
Harmonizing means the G7 agrees on strict rules to verify where the core components actually come from. Furthermore, if the U.S., Europe, and Japan are all aggressively competing against each other to secure the same lithium deals in friendly countries, they just drive up the prices and cannibalize each other. They have to coordinate their investments.
But the most surprising pivot in the playbook to me was about Iran. The analysis argues that any post-conflict reconstruction needs to offer Iran actual, tangible incentives for keeping the strait open. That feels really counterintuitive given the military conflict.
It represents a strictly realist perspective. A geopolitical system built entirely on punishing Iran has repeatedly failed. It simply makes closing the strait their most valuable leverage point.
Right.
The authors argue that to ensure long-term durable stability, Iran has to be integrated into the regional economy. You offer them infrastructure financing or conditional trade access. You basically have to engineer a scenario where the economic benefit of keeping the strait open is vastly higher than the strategic benefit of shutting it down. They need skin in the game.
So, if I'm synthesizing all of this, we're moving from a world that operated like a perfectly synchronized city grid where you could flip a switch and get whatever you wanted just in time for incredibly cheap.
Right.
And we're transitioning to a world where every country essentially has to build an off-the-grid house. They have to buy their own solar panels, dig their own wells, and stockpile their own batteries. It's incredibly resilient, but the upfront cost is astronomical compared to just paying the monthly utility bill.
That captures the transition perfectly. The academic term for that off-the-grid approach is resilience-adjusted regionalism.
Resilience-adjusted regionalism.
Yeah. Efficiency and cheapness are out. Resilience and redundancy are in. And as you pointed out, resilience is inherently expensive.
Which brings us to the big overarching takeaway of this entire deep dive. Where does this leave the global economy?
The central thesis is that the deflationary era of hyperglobalization is definitively over. For decades, consumers in the West enjoyed cheap goods because global supply chains were perfectly optimized and the oceans were undisputed, safe transit zones.
Right.
But the IMF's recent revision of global inflation up to 4.4% for 2026 is not a temporary spike. It is a structural floor. Geopolitical risk premiums are now permanently embedded into the price of manufacturing and shipping everything.
So what does this all mean? If you're listening to this right now, the higher prices you're seeing at the pump, the sticker shock at the grocery store, the delays on your packages, these are no longer glitches in a broken system. They are the new permanent insurance premium for living in a fragmented, multipolar world. The global economy isn't going to simply go back to normal because the old normal relied on a peace dividend that has vanished.
Exactly. The assumption of predictable, frictionless maritime access has been shattered, likely for a generation.
And that leaves me with a final thought, something not explicitly laid out in the pages of this analysis, but that builds right off this idea of permanent disruption. If global supply chains now require military-grade redundancy and physical protection just to function, how will this redefine the modern multinational corporation?
It's a great question.
Think about companies like Amazon or global shipping giants like Maersk. Their entire business models rely on moving physical goods across oceans. If the world's sea lanes are no longer guaranteed safe transit zones under the umbrella of the U.S. Navy, will these mega corporations eventually need to evolve? Will we see a future where logistics companies hire their own private intelligence agencies?
Or their own navy.
Right. Will they need their own private foreign policies to negotiate safe passage with state militaries or navigate the axis of evasion? Because when the global trade network fractures, the entities with the capital and the desperation to rebuild it might not just be governments. The world is holding its breath right now to see who makes the next move. Until next time, keep digging deeper.